that they completely didn't even think of that problem. So there are many techniques to protect equipment, but you see the cases I mentioned, radar and an AM radio station, the signal was there, so they knew they had a problem and they could deal with it. The problem with EMP is you don't know about the problem until it arrives.
Is there no way to detect it beforehand?
It travels at the speed of light, and once you detect it, it's happened.
Got it.
That's the problem. And in the high-frequency part, which affects small equipment, it is the first part of the signal that comes out. So there's really no warning. The only warning you would have would be that a missile has been launched somewhere toward the United States, and that would give you, depending where it's launched from, 10 to 30 minutes of notice.
That's just so shocking that we live in such of seemingly technologically advanced society, and yet we have this Achilles heel that's so formidable. It's shocking.
Yeah, well, we're, in fact, even introducing through, in our homes, so many electronic types of equipment that themselves can be interfered with by cellular telephones. If you get your cellular phone close enough to enough equipment, you will find that it will have problems. It's and cellular phone signals, the transmitter part, are much they're much lower signals than we're dealing with in these other threats. So we know from testing of equipment that equipment will be affected by a high altitude EMP and by electromagnetic weapons. There's no question. The question is what will happen afterwards. You know, will you be able to recover, or will it take a long time to buy new equipment or to get the electric power going again?
So the whole power would be out, and you have access to pretty much. Yeah,
I don't think there's any question of that. That's, in fact, was stated by the EMP Commission. On the other hand, blackouts, have happened before, and big ones. We had a big one in August of 2003. But fortunately, there wasn't a lot of damage to equipment. A power outage occurs if there's an imbalance between generation and load, and if it happens very quickly, then that imbalance causes a blackout. But after the blackout is over, they have to bring the power grid back up, and as long as transformers are still are not damaged and other electronics are not damaged, they can slowly, over a couple of days, bring the power back. But if you have damaged transformers, you can't run electricity through them. So anybody depending on a transformer in a certain region will be without power until that transformer is fixed. And that's the problem, is if you have a lot of damage, then it could take a long time to recover.
What about ports? Could ports use this?
I'm sorry, ports?
Could ports use this? How about airports?
Oh,
God.
Well, airports have, of course, they have radar, but they have a lot of computers, and even the FAA from time to time, computer systems will go down, and when that happens, they have to close the airport or reroute traffic. So yes, the computer systems would be a concern, and one would have to look at how they're protected, if at all, from these sorts of threats.
My God.
The military knows how to protect, and we do know how to do it. It's just it costs some money, and the question is whether even the federal government is willing to pay a little bit extra to protect the equipment when they build it. And it's harder after it's built to do the protection. It's more expensive at that point.
But it's like all this infrastructure standing in sand. The vulnerability is astronomical, and there's no recovery. The recovery is so exponentially terrible, and the mass results are so terrible, manifestations of what could happen, that it's almost the demolishing of society as we know it.
Yeah, well, that's one of the EMP commissioners made that statement in slightly different words, but I think he made a statement that we would be back to the 1800s before electricity. And while certainly people survived at that time, were much more dependent on the electrical equipment, then of course they didn't have that to be dependent on. And another important statement, and you've echoed it a couple times, this was Dr. Lowell Wood, Commissioner. He made the statement that we have an obvious vulnerability, and if we do nothing, we are inviting attack. And that is a quote from him. And that is the problem. And it's, you might say, well, why would he make such a statement? And his feeling was, and I agree with him from what I have seen throughout the world, the basics of how the high-altitude EMP work are well known throughout the world, and the only people, by not saying this, the only people you are keeping in the dark is the American people. Our enemies fully know what could happen. So that is the problem.
I would imagine that electromagnetic pulse energy has been around for a long time, aside from being part of geomagnetic storms and space weather, that this technology has been around how many years, Bill?
Well, again, we have to be careful of the terminology, but the high-altitude electromagnetic pulse really comes only from a nuclear weapon. So it did not exist until Trinity test. So there was nothing called an electromagnetic pulse before that. Now, more commonly today, people are making using the term in many different ways, and so it can be a bit confusing. But obviously, geomagnetic storms, which is not it is an electromagnetic signal, but we should not call it an electromagnetic pulse. It's a geomagnetic storm, a solar storm, if you wish.
I appreciate the correction.
Yeah, and that, well, it's a problem of confusion. It's in the newspapers every day. Also, the electromagnetic weapons. They produce an electromagnetic signal, which some people call an EMP. And this can get confusing when one opens the newspaper and sees that South Korea is developing an electromagnetic pulse weapon. Well, the first question is, have they decided to also develop a nuclear weapon in addition to North Korea? No, of course not. That is not the case. It is just an electromagnetic weapon that they wanted to build to defend themselves in a way against the North. I mean, that's the article I read. So the terminology can be confusing. But in terms of electromagnetic signals, really until we had radio, a situation of radio where we were transmitting electromagnetic waves, radio waves, in the early 1900s, there really was very little. There was only one real source of high-energy electromagnetics, lightning, of course. We've had that for a long time. It produces intense electromagnetic signals in addition to the current striking a building or a person, unfortunately. But the other one is electrostatic discharge, when you touch something and you get an arc to the equipment, usually in areas of dry humidity. That generates an electromagnetic signal. It's essentially a small lightning arc, much less current, but because it's right next to the electronics where you're touching, it can damage the electronics. So that's something that is a concern to modern electronics. The electromagnetic signal was always there, but there was very little to damage, say, in the 1800s.
And of course, we have so many more people on the Earth now.
Yes, well, and that's the big problem with our dependence on computers, and I certainly wouldn't suggest we try to do without them. But it is true that the computer manufacturers have done a very good job over the last 10 years of making sure that their computers don't emit too much radiation to affect electromagnetic radiation to affect radio communications, so they don't interfere with radio. But also in that process, they've actually protected themselves a little bit better than they used to be protected, say, 10 years ago. So there is some improvement, but they're not doing that for EMP. They're doing it for normal, day-to-day operations. People want their computers